The moment Edgar Shelby spotted the crumpled figure lying face down in the red Nevada dust, every instinct in his body told him to ride on and not look back. He had learned, somewhere between the war and the years that followed it, that getting involved in other people's troubles was the surest way to end up carrying sorrows that didn't belong to you. He had a destination, a purpose, and a temperament that had been carefully hardened against the kind of softness that made men do foolish things. He was 31 years old, lean and weathered and deliberate, and he had not spoken more than 20 necessary words to another human soul in the better part of 2 months. He liked it that way. He told himself he liked it that way every single morning. It was the spring of 1878, late April, when the desert was still cold enough at night to make your bones ache, but warm enough by midday to bake the moisture out of everything living. Edgar was riding the trail between Reno and the silver mining settlement of Caldera Flats, where a man named Horace Tuttle owed him $43 for a fence he had built the previous autumn. $43 was enough money to keep him fed and sheltered for the better part of a summer, and Edgar intended to collect every cent of it. His horse, a dark bay gelding he called Drum on account of the way the animal's hooves struck the earth with unusual precision, slowed without being asked. Drum always slowed when something was wrong. Edgar had come to trust that instinct in the animal more than he trusted most things in the world. He pulled up and looked down from the saddle. The woman was lying on her side in the dirt about 15 feet off the main trail, half concealed by a stand of scrubby sage. Her dress had been a pale blue once, though it was now the color of the desert floor. Her dark hair was loose and spread across the ground, tangled with bits of brush. A canvas traveling bag had been flung some distance away, its contents scattered: a comb, a small tin of something, a folded letter, a lady's shoe, as if it had been thrown or had fallen from a moving wagon. There was no wagon. There was no horse. There was nothing else around for as far as Edgar could see in any direction. He sat in the saddle for a long moment, telling himself he was only assessing the situation. Then he climbed down. He crouched beside her and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck, the way the field medic from his regiment had taught him to do, and he felt the pulse immediately faint but steady, ticking along with the stubbornness of something that had not yet decided to quit. She was breathing. Her skin was hot in a way that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. He turned her gently onto her back and saw her face for the first time. She was young, perhaps 23 or 24, with strong cheekbones and a wide mouth, and a faint scatter of freckles across her nose that the Nevada sun had drawn out. There was a cut along her left temple, dried blood matting her hair, and her lips were badly cracked from dehydration. Whoever she was, she had been lying here for some time. Edgar looked up and down the trail again. He looked at the scattered belongings. He looked at the sky, which was cloudless and indifferent and already beginning to lean toward afternoon. He went and collected her things, stuffing them back into the canvas bag with the brisk efficiency of a man who had made a decision, and intended to execute it quickly before he could think about it any further. He brought the bag back, tied it to Drum's saddle, and then he lifted the woman from the ground with the care a person gives to something they do not fully understand yet. She weighed less than he expected, and something about that bothered him. She made a small sound when he picked her up, not quite a word, not quite a name, just a sound at the boundary of consciousness, and Edgar felt it land somewhere in the center of his chest like a stone dropped into still water. "Easy," he said, which was the same word he used with Drum when the horse was frightened, and it was the first word he had spoken aloud in 4 days. He settled her across the saddle as best he could, mounting behind her and keeping one arm around her so she wouldn't slide. Drum shifted uncertainly, unused to carrying 2, but Edgar pressed his knee once against the animal's flank and they moved forward at a steady walk. The nearest place with a roof and a woman who might help was a stage relay station called Harker's Rest, run by a couple named Bess and Walt Grover, which sat approximately 6 miles south along a side trail he knew from 3 previous crossings of this country. Edgar adjusted his direction without ceremony and rode toward it. He did not think about how the woman's head had settled against his chest as though it belonged there. He did not think about that at all. Bess Grover was a woman of approximately 55 with gray hair pinned severely, and the no-nonsense expression of someone who had watched the desert eat 3 relay riders and 2 mail coaches in her 20 years at the station. She came out of the front door before Edgar had fully dismounted, reading the situation with the speed of long practice. "Bring her inside," she said. "Walt, heat water." Walt Grover appeared in the doorway, a man of similar age and similar weathering, and disappeared back inside without a word. Edgar carried the woman through the low door and laid her on the narrow cot in the back room that the Grovers kept for stage passengers who needed to rest. The room smelled of lye soap and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. It was one of the cleaner rooms Edgar had been in for some time. "What happened to her?" Bess asked, already at work with a damp cloth on the woman's face and temple. "I don't know," Edgar said. "Found her on the trail north of the Juniper Fork. No horse, no wagon, no companion that I could see. Her bag had been scattered." "Fever," Bess said, pressing the back of her hand to the woman's forehead. "Bad one, and this cut needs cleaning." She looked up at Edgar with the measuring expression of someone deciding how much trust to extend. "You'll stay until she's stable. I'll not send a sick woman away on your saddle into the dark." Edgar could not have said why he didn't argue. He simply nodded. He went out and tended to Drum, giving the horse water from the station's trough and a portion of the oat supply he paid Bess for with coin from his vest pocket. He sat outside on the low bench beside the front door as the afternoon aged, and the shadows stretched long across the hard ground, and he listened to the sounds of Bess moving around inside with the brisk authority of a woman who knew exactly what to do with sickness. Toward evening, Bess appeared at the door. "She's burning hard. We've got the fever working in her and she's been calling out in her sleep. Nothing I can make sense of. She has a name on a letter in her bag, Minnie Ford of Springfield, Missouri. That help you any?" "No," Edgar said honestly. "Didn't think so." Bess sat down on the other end of the bench. "You eaten?" "Not since morning. Walt will have beans on shortly." She looked at him sideways. "You're one of those quiet ones, I suppose. The kind that sees a woman dying in the desert and picks her up anyway." Edgar said nothing to that. "There are worse kinds," Bess said, and went back inside. He ate beans with Walt at the rough-hewn table near the fire, and Walt talked in the comfortable, unhurried way of a man used to his own company, speaking about the quality of the spring grass and the rumor of a new silver strike 20 miles east, and the fact that the stage from Carson City was 2 days late. Edgar listened without much response, and Walt didn't seem to require any. It was the kind of easy, undemanding company that Edgar could tolerate. After supper, he went and stood in the doorway of the back room. Minnie Ford was lying with the rough wool blanket pulled to her chin, her dark hair still loose around her. Bess had cleaned the cut at her temple, which was small and neat under the dried blood. In the lamplight she looked younger than she had in the desert, or maybe it was that the tension of unconsciousness had smoothed something in her face. She was muttering again, low words he couldn't catch, her fingers moving slightly against the blanket as if she were trying to hold onto something. He didn't go in. He stood in the doorway for a minute, maybe 2, and then he went and laid his bedroll out on the relay station's front porch and stared up at a sky absolutely crowded with stars. He thought about Horace Tuttle's $43. He thought about the way Minnie Ford had weighed almost nothing when he picked her up. He thought about the next morning and told himself firmly that he would assess whether she was stable enough to leave in Bess Grover's capable hands, and then he would ride on. Morning came and she was not stable. The fever had broken briefly in the small hours and then climbed again, and Bess was tight-lipped about it in a way that communicated worry without dramatizing it. Edgar fed Drum and ate Bess's strong coffee and hard biscuits and did not ride on. He found small, useful things to do around the station. Walt's fence along the south side of the corral had rotted through in 2 places, and Edgar fixed it with the posts and wire in the supply shed without being asked. He checked the relay horses for loose shoes and found one, and reset it using the small farrier kit in the stable with the practiced movements of a man who had done the work before. He split a cord of wood that had been waiting since winter. Walt watched him work from a distance with the quiet approval of someone who recognized competence. On the second afternoon, Bess called him inside. Minnie Ford was awake. She was propped against the rough headboard with the wool blanket around her shoulders, and her eyes were open, very dark brown. Edgar noticed immediately, the color of creek water in shadow, and she was taking him in with an expression that managed to be simultaneously watchful and exhausted. "This is the man who found you," Bess said from behind Edgar, in a tone that suggested she had already told Minnie this but was repeating it for his benefit. "Edgar Shelby. He brought you in." Minnie Ford looked at Edgar for a long moment. Her voice, when it came, was rough from fever and disuse, but it had a direct, unflinching quality that surprised him. "Did you also pick up my things?" "What was left of them," he said. "My letter was in the bag. It's still there, I didn't read it." Something shifted in her face, relief, maybe, or the decision to believe him. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that was more than courtesy. Bess set a cup of broth on the small crate that served as a bedside table. "You need to drink this and not talk too much until that fever is fully gone. There'll be time for all of it later." Minnie picked up the cup with both hands, which was when Edgar saw that her hands were trembling slightly. Not from fear, he thought, but from the simple physical aftermath of days of fever. She drank the broth steadily, without complaint, and did not look like a woman who had ever much enjoyed being made to slow down. Edgar went back outside. He sat on the bench and tried to figure out what was happening to him, because something was clearly happening, and he had a policy of identifying such things before they got out of hand. The trouble was that identification did not seem to be doing anything useful. By the third day, Minnie Ford was sitting up for longer stretches, and Bess had determined she was past the worst of it and began allowing short conversations. Edgar found himself pulled inside by increments he could not account for, first just delivering water when Bess asked him to, then staying because Minnie asked him a direct question, then staying because she asked another one, and he found he wanted to answer it. She had come west from Springfield, Missouri, traveling by stage to meet a cousin who had settled near Caldera Flats with her husband, a mine foreman. She had been 3 days out of Reno when the stage suffered a broken axle near the Juniper Fork. The driver had sent the male passengers on the relay horses to the nearest settlement for help, which was a practical decision that had left the 2 female passengers waiting. The other woman, a Mrs. Peabody traveling to meet her own husband, had been collected the following morning by a ranch hand who had been sent back with a spare horse. But by then Minnie had developed the fever, and in the confused hours that followed, she had apparently wandered from the stage in a state of delirium, and no one had noticed until she was gone. This last part she delivered without self-pity, only a dry, matter-of-fact tone that made Edgar think she had considered the alternative at least once. "They didn't come looking for you?" he asked. "Perhaps they did and didn't find me in time," she said. She was quiet for a moment. "Perhaps the driver assumed Mrs. Peabody's ranch hand had taken us both. There's no way to know from here. We could send word to Caldera Flats. Your cousin will be worried." Minnie looked at him steadily. "Would you do that?" He had not intended the offer as anything more than a practical suggestion. He recognized now that she had heard it as a personal offer of help, and he could either confirm it or retract it. He did not retract it. "Walt can get a letter on the next stage," he said. "If you write it, it'll go." "I'll write it this afternoon," she said, and something in her expression changed, not dramatically, not sentimentally, but in the way a guarded door opens exactly 1 degree further. "Mr. Shelby." "Edgar," he said, and was surprised that he'd said it. "Edgar," she repeated, and the way she said it was careful, as if she were putting the word somewhere she intended to keep it. He went outside and sat on the bench for a long time after that, and did not think about Horace Tuttle's $43 even once. The letter went on the stage when it came through the following morning, addressed to Miss Clara Hatch, care of the Caldera Flats mine office, and Walt sent it with a cheerful confidence in the postal service that Edgar had never shared but did not contradict. That same afternoon, Minnie was well enough to sit outside on the bench in the afternoon sun, wrapped in Bess's heavy shawl with a cup of tea, and for the first time Edgar saw her in full daylight without the shadow of fever on her face. She looked better than he had expected, which was a thing he noticed and immediately tried to stop noticing. She was looking at the desert with an expression of focused, unsentimental curiosity that he recognized without being able to name it, the expression of someone taking an account of their circumstances and deciding what to do with them. "Do you know the country between here and Caldera Flats?" she asked without preamble when he sat down at the other end of the bench. "Well enough," he said. "I need to get there. My cousin will be worried sick by now. The letter will help, but I should not be sitting at a relay station for another 2 weeks. You're still not fully well." "I'm aware of that." She looked at him with the directness that he was coming to understand was simply how she communicated. "But I'm aware of it and capable of making decisions about it, which is more than I was 3 days ago." Edgar considered the landscape in the direction of Caldera Flats. He had been going there himself before any of this. Horace Tuttle still owed him $43. The route was not complicated. The fact that it was also the route he already intended to travel made the offer logistically simple. He told himself it was logistically simple. "I'm riding to Caldera Flats myself," he said. "I have business there." Minnie turned to look at him. "You're welcome to ride along," he added, "if you're well enough and Bess thinks it's reasonable. Drum can carry double for short stages if we take it slow. I would not want to delay your business." "My business has waited this long. A few more days won't ruin it." She studied him for a moment with those dark-water eyes, and Edgar had the unsettling experience of feeling genuinely seen by another person, not assessed, not measured, but actually seen. "All right," she said simply. "Thank you." He nodded and looked back out at the desert, which was turning gold in the late afternoon the way it did when it was trying to make you forget how brutal it had been to you all day. Bess Grover's verdict, delivered the following morning with a comprehensive assessment of Minnie's pulse, temperature, and pallor, was that the girl was functional but not entirely mended, and that if she absolutely had to travel she should travel slowly with rest periods, and that Edgar Shelby had better make sure of it. Edgar said he would make sure of it. Bess packed them a supply of dried beef, hardtack, 3 oranges she had been hoarding since the last supply wagon, and a small packet of willow bark powder in case the fever tried to return. She pressed all of this into Edgar's hands with the brisk, unsentimental generosity of someone who has long since stopped worrying about whether generosity will be recognized or repaid. "She's a sensible woman," Bess told Edgar quietly, while Minnie was adjusting the saddle pack on Drum's left side with more competence than Bess had apparently expected. "Not the kind that makes trouble, but she's got a spirit on her and she won't be coddled. Mind you don't try." "I wasn't planning to coddle anyone," Edgar said. Bess looked at him with 55 years of perception behind her eyes. "No," she said thoughtfully. "I don't imagine you were." She didn't say anything further, but her expression had the particular quality of someone keeping a thought comfortably to herself. They rode out at mid-morning, keeping to a steady walk, Minnie in front with Edgar behind, one arm available to steady her if the trail grew rough. She held herself upright and did not lean, which he had expected. The first 2 miles passed in silence that was, he noted with some surprise, not uncomfortable. She was the first to speak. "What business do you have in Caldera Flats? A man named Tuttle owes me money for fence work. Did you build fences for a long time? I've done most things for a while and then moved on. Fencing, hauling, some cattle work. I was a carpenter in the years right after the war." She was quiet for a moment. "Were you in the war?" "Yes." Which side, if you don't mind my asking? Union, he said. She nodded. My father also. He didn't come back from Gettysburg. I'm sorry for it. He was a good man, she said, with the tone of someone who has thoroughly processed grief and arrived at something stable on the other side of it. After that, my mother and I managed the house in Springfield with my uncle's help until my mother remarried. The new situation wasn't bad, but it wasn't ours. She paused. That's partly why I came west. My cousin Clara wrote that the country was large enough to build something in. Edgar thought about that. He had come west for different reasons, or no reasons, or reasons that had mostly dissolved in the years of solitary riding and had become simply motion, the habit of moving forward because stopping required a reason to stop. Is that why you travel alone? She asked, and it was a perceptive enough question that it startled him slightly. Because you're building something. I don't think I've been building anything, he said after a moment. I think I've mostly been moving. She considered that. Where were you moving toward before you found me? $43, she laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh. It was a full, warm sound, unguarded, the kind of laugh that seems to arrive from somewhere deep, and the desert did something with the sound of it that Edgar did not have language for. That's an honest answer, she said. I don't have much else to offer, he said, and meant it more seriously than it sounded. They stopped at midday beside a shallow seasonal creek where the cottonwood trees were just budding out, their pale green softening the severity of the desert scrub. Edgar helped Minnie down from the saddle. She accepted the help with the pragmatism of someone who recognized that her legs were not yet reliable, and she sat on a flat rock at the water's edge while he watered drum and they ate the hardtack and dried beef from Bess's supply. One of the oranges was divided between them. Edgar had not sat companionably with another person and shared a meal in longer than he could clearly remember. The experience of it was strange, not unpleasant, just strange. The way a room feels when you've been outside in the cold long enough that the warmth of it registers almost as a kind of pain. Can I ask you something? Minnie said, peeling her orange section with careful fingers. You've been asking me things all morning. That's true. She looked at him directly, which was her habit. Why did you stop for me? People pass through that country regularly. You could have ridden on. He thought about it honestly because she deserved honesty and seemed capable of handling it. Drum slowed down, he said. My horse. He slows when something's wrong, and I saw you were breathing. After that, I just did what needed doing. She looked at him steadily. That's it. You just did what needed doing. I've done a great many things simply because they needed doing, he said. I don't know that I've always had more reason than that. Minnie was quiet for a moment, and the creek moved past them with a hushed, persistent sound, and the cottonwoods shifted in the warm breeze with the papery rustle of young leaves. I'd like to think there was more to it than that, she said, not as a reproach, but as a statement of her own preference openly given. You're welcome to think it, Edgar said, and then added with an honesty that surprised him, and you might be right. Something moved through her expression, brief and quiet, like light passing through water, and then she looked back at the creek and finished her orange. They traveled until the afternoon shadow grew long and the color went out of the day, camping that night at a sheltered spot between two low rock outcroppings that Edgar knew from previous crossings. He built a small fire and arranged his bedroll on the far side of it, giving her the sheltered side near the rock, and spread his extra blanket on the ground for her since hers had stayed at the relay station. This is yours, Minnie said, picking it up. You're still getting over a fever, he said. Keep it. She folded it across her lap with the expression of someone who had decided not to have an argument about this particular thing. Thank you. He sat across the fire with his back against the rock and fed small sticks into the flames, and the night settled around them with the vast, pressing silence of the open desert. Above them the stars were extraordinary, the kind of sky you could only see when you were far enough from any town that human light didn't interfere with it. It's very beautiful out here, Minnie said quietly, looking up. I mean the sky. I understand the country is brutal, but the sky is extraordinary. It is, Edgar said. Do you ever get lonely, she asked. Traveling the way you do alone. He considered the word. I don't know if lonely is the right word for it. I've gotten used to my own company. But there are times when he stopped, because the thought was not one he had put into words before and he was not certain it would survive the translation. When? She pressed gently. When something happens that you'd want to tell someone, he said finally. When you see something in the landscape or an animal does something strange, and for a second you want to turn and say, "Did you see that?" And there's no one there. Minnie was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice had a quality he hadn't heard in it before, softer, more personal. I know exactly what you mean, exactly. The fire cracked and settled. An owl announced itself from somewhere in the dark and was answered from a greater distance, and then the silence closed in again. Edgar thought he should sleep. He stayed awake for another hour without entirely meaning to. On the second day of their journey, about 6 miles from Caldera Flats, they came around a bend in the trail and found the road blocked by a wagon with a broken wheel. The driver, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Denny Fawkes, as he introduced himself, working at the wheel with a mallet and considerable frustration. Beside the wagon stood a boy of perhaps 12 and a younger girl, both watching their father with the particular anxiety of children whose confidence in an adult's competence is being tested. Edgar dismounted and assessed the wheel without being asked, and Minnie, demonstrating the independent judgment that was apparently a fixed feature of her character, climbed down from the saddle on her own and went to speak to the children, who were immediately and visibly put at ease by her. The wheel needed a new spoke and better leverage than one man with a mallet could provide. Edgar cut a spoke from a length of dry wood he found in the back of Fawkes's own wagon, shaped it with the man's hand axe, and fitted it into the hub with Fawkes doing the holding and Edgar doing the driving. The repair took the better part of an hour. During that time, Minnie sat with the children on a flat rock and told them about Springfield, Missouri, in a tone that made Missouri sound like an exotic and fascinating country, and the children listened with complete attention and stopped worrying about their father. When the wheel was repaired and the wagon ready to move, Denny Fawkes wrung Edgar's hand with a grip that suggested genuine gratitude. His wife, it turned out, was in the back of the wagon, ill with something that had forced them to slow their pace considerably, and the wheel had felt to him like the end of the world. "Your wife and children?" Fawkes asked, nodding toward Minnie and the children. "No," Edgar said. Fawkes looked at him with the knowing expression of a man who had heard the word no mean several different things in his lifetime. "Well," he said diplomatically, "you make a capable pair either way." Edgar went back to where Drum was tied and did not think about what Denny Fawkes had said. He thought about it all the way to Caldera Flats. Caldera Flats in the spring of 1878 was a settlement of approximately 460 souls, held together by the silver mine to the east, a single main street of wooden front buildings, 2 saloons, a hardware store, a land office, a doctor's office, a church still under construction, and the general air of determined permanence that settlements take on when they've decided to outlast the boom. It was not a beautiful place, but it had the quality of intention about it. You could see in the straight lines of the new buildings that people expected to still be here in 20 years. They rode in at midday, and Edgar found the mine office first, asking after Clara Hatch from the foreman's assistant, a young man with ink on his fingers who disappeared into the back room and returned with Clara herself, a woman of about 26, clearly Minnie's cousin in the structure of her face and the directness of her bearing, though she was fair where Minnie was dark. Clara's reaction to seeing Minnie alive and upright was not tears, but an immediate, fierce embrace that communicated everything tears would have, and then a torrent of rapid speech about the letter arriving only yesterday, and the telegram she'd sent to the stage company, and the nights she'd lain awake. Minnie submitted to the embrace and listened to the speech and patted Clara's back with the steady patience of someone who loves well and knows how. During all of this, Edgar dismounted and held Drum's reins and stood a respectful distance away. Clara Hatch noticed him eventually, with an expression that assessed him in approximately 3 seconds and arrived at a provisional positive verdict. "Edgar Shelby," she said. "I've been calling your name a blessing in my prayers since that letter arrived." "Just happened to be passing the right trail," he said. Clara looked at Minnie. Minnie looked at Edgar. Something passed between the cousins that Edgar could not read. "You'll come to dinner," Clara said, and it was not a question. "My husband Daniel will want to thank you properly. We have a spare room. You'll stay the night at minimum." Edgar started to decline. "Please," Minnie said quietly, and that single word was enough to stop him. He said he would come to dinner. Clara and Daniel Hatch kept a small but solid house on the eastern side of the settlement, close enough to the mine that you could hear the shift bell at certain times of day. Daniel Hatch was a quiet, competent man of 32 with a miner's hands, and the straightforward character of someone who had learned early that plain dealing was the most efficient form of social transaction. He thanked Edgar with the brevity of a man who meant what he said and didn't add to it, and Edgar liked him immediately. Dinner was the best meal Edgar had eaten in months: roasted chicken and potatoes and fresh bread. Because Clara had been saving the chicken for something important, she explained, and this seemed adequately important. They sat at the table in the lamplight, the four of them, and the conversation moved with the natural ease of people who have been through something together, even if most of them had not been present for the hardest part of it. Minnie sat across from Edgar and talked more freely than she had on the trail, with the relaxed quality of someone in the company of people she trusted completely, and Edgar found himself watching her in a way he did not examine too carefully. She had a way of telling a story clear, unembellished, with a quiet humor at the precise moments you did not expect it. That made you want to hear the next one before the current one was finished. After dinner, Daniel Hatch produced a bottle of whiskey and poured 2 glasses for himself and Edgar, and they sat on the narrow front porch while the women talked inside. "She told us about you on the trail," Daniel said, after a while. "I didn't do much," Edgar said. "She doesn't see it that way." Daniel looked at his glass. "She's had a harder time of it than she lets on. Her mother's second husband was not the kind of man a woman or her daughter deserved. She came west to start clean. She's got a great deal of courage, more than she gives herself credit for." Edgar thought of Minnie lying in the desert with a fever doing its best to kill her, and the way she had woken up and asked about her letter, clear and direct through the blur of it. He thought of her on the trail, refusing to be coddled, making assessments with unsentimental precision. "I believe that," he said. Daniel looked at him with the same kind of quick assessment his wife had made and came to the same kind of provisional verdict. "You're staying in Caldera Flats a while." "I have business with Horace Tuttle," Edgar said. "Tuttle," Daniel repeated, with the expression of a man who has opinions about Horace Tuttle. "Watch yourself with him. He pays, but he makes you work for it." The business with Horace Tuttle proved to be exactly as advertised. Tuttle was a solidly built man of 60, with a prosperous air, and the deeply ingrained habit of pretending not to remember things he found financially inconvenient. He met Edgar in his land office the following morning and expressed a touching uncertainty about whether it had been $43 agreed or $38, and wasn't there something about the materials having been supplied that should be deducted. Edgar had anticipated this. He produced from his vest pocket a folded, somewhat travel-worn piece of paper on which the original agreement had been written in both their hands and signed in front of a witness, and laid it on Tuttle's desk with the quiet confidence of a man who had dealt with Horace Tuttles before. Tuttle studied the paper, and then studied Edgar, and then studied the paper again. He paid $43 in good coin without further conversation. That same afternoon, Edgar was sitting in the Caldera Flats Hardware and Supply, talking to the owner, a man named Rhodes, who was also the informal clearinghouse for all labor information in the settlement, when he learned that the church being built at the east end of the main street needed a carpenter. He told himself he was only asking about it because it was what he did. He told himself that. He asked about it anyway. The church committee, represented by a somewhat harried woman named Mrs. Edna Park, was willing to engage Edgar on a monthly basis to complete the framing and interior work, at a wage that was reasonable and in coin that was reliable. Edgar said he would think about it. He went back to the Hatch house, where he had taken the spare room for a second night after Daniel had pressed the point with practical generosity. Minnie was in the kitchen with Clara, the two of them engaged in the rapid, intertwined conversation of people who know each other very well and have much to catch up on. When Edgar appeared in the doorway, the conversation paused. "Tuttle paid?" Minnie asked. "Tuttle paid." "Good," she said, with a satisfaction that seemed to be genuinely on his behalf, and something in that simplicity struck him with disproportionate force. He took a chair at the kitchen table, which apparently he was now in the habit of doing, and Clara set a cup of coffee in front of him with the easy hospitality of someone who had decided he belonged here. "There's carpenter work at the new church," he said. Clara looked at him. Minnie looked at him. Edgar looked at his coffee. "You're thinking of staying," Clara said, and it was not quite a question. "I'm thinking about work," he said. "Those are not mutually exclusive things," Clara observed pleasantly, and went back to whatever she was doing at the stove. Edgar looked up and found Minnie watching him with an expression that was careful and warm in equal measure, which was a combination he had not encountered before and did not know what to do with. "Would that be all right?" he asked, and he was not at all sure he was asking about the church work. "I think," Minnie said, choosing her words with the deliberation of someone who understands the weight of them, "that it would be very all right." He started work on the church that Monday. The framing was solid enough, but the interior was unfinished in ways that would take several months of consistent work. The pews were rough lumber needing proper planing and joining. The pulpit was a box nailed together by someone who had enthusiasm but not technique, and the windows needed proper casing if they were to keep the desert wind out with any reliability. Edgar set to work with the focused satisfaction of a man whose skills are well matched to a task in front of him. He worked in the mornings and sometimes through to late afternoon, and in the early evenings he found himself, with a regularity that surprised him less and less, at the Hatch kitchen table. Minnie had settled into the Hatch household with the practical ease of someone who is genuinely useful rather than a burden, helping Clara with the house, befriending the women of the settlement, and beginning, he learned this gradually, to teach the children of 3 mining families their letters and numbers, because there was no school teacher in Caldera Flats yet, and there were children who needed teaching. He went by the makeshift schoolroom one afternoon. It was the back of the land office, donated 3 afternoons a week by a land agent named Parker who was trying to improve his standing with the settlement's families, and stood in the open doorway without going in, watching Minnie at the front of the room with chalk and a piece of dark-painted board, writing out a column of sums. She had them working hard, these 8 children ranging from 6 to 13, and they were working gladly, which told him something about her. The oldest was a girl of 13 named Rose Patterly, who had the quick, eager intelligence of someone who has never had enough to feed it, and Minnie had clearly identified this and was working accordingly. Edgar stood in the doorway longer than he had intended. Minnie glanced over as the session ended and the children tumbled out past his legs, and her expression when she saw him was uncomplicated and bright. "You're spying on my school," she said. "I was walking past." "You've walked past this building every day for 2 weeks and today you stopped." "I had a slower afternoon," he said. She looked at him with the expression he was beginning to know, the one that said she was tolerating the deflection with good humor, and both of them knew it. He came in and helped her stack the slates that the children used in place of paper, and she told him about Rose Patterly, and how she was already thinking beyond what could be taught informally and would need a proper school. And Edgar listened, and said he thought the settlement would have one within a few years, which seemed to satisfy her. When they had finished with the slates, they were standing close together at the narrow table at the front of the room, and the afternoon light came through the unglazed window at a low angle that caught the side of Minnie's face with the precision of something deliberate. Edgar thought, with sudden clarity, that he had not been building anything before he found her in the desert, but that he was building something now. He thought he should tell her this. He picked up his hat instead and said he would walk her back to the Hatch house, and she picked up her bag and said that would be fine. And they walked through the late afternoon streets of Caldera Flats side by side, in a silence that had become one of the most comfortable things he had ever inhabited. The Saturday social at the end of May was the major event of the Caldera Flats social calendar, a weekly gathering at the saloon that was not technically a saloon event, but used the saloon's space and approximate infrastructure because it was the largest building in the settlement. Families came. Music was provided by a fiddler named Gordo Reyes and his brother on guitar, and the general population of the settlement turned out to dance and talk and conduct the social business that kept a small community cohesive. Edgar went because Clara Hatch said it would be strange if he didn't, and because Daniel Hatch said the same thing, and because Minnie said nothing either way, and he found himself wanting to go wherever she was. He was not, and had never been, a natural dancer. He was comfortable enough on a floor to not embarrass himself, but it was not something he sought out. He stood near the wall for the first half of the evening and watched Minnie dance 2 sets with Daniel and 1 with a young man from the mine named Carter, and he noticed that he had opinions about Carter that were not strictly rational. Minnie came to stand beside him during the break between sets, flushed from dancing and with a loose strand of dark hair across her face that she pushed back with an unself-conscious gesture. "You're not dancing," she said. "I'm watching." "You watch a great many things," she said. "I'm a careful observer." That's a polite way to describe someone who won't commit to a dance floor. She was smiling, and there was a warmth in it that was aimed directly at him. "Will you dance with me?" he asked, and the question came out with more directness than he had intended, not as a casual invitation but as something more serious, which perhaps was more honest. She held out her hand. They danced the next set, which was fortunately a slow, straightforward waltz rather than anything that required complex footwork. Edgar was stiff for the first few measures, hyper-aware of the distance between them, and then of the absence of that distance as the dance drew them together, Minnie's hand in his and her other hand on his shoulder, and her face tilted up because she was considerably shorter than him, which he registered now in a way he hadn't before. He watched where he was putting his feet. "Look at me," she said, "not at the floor." He looked at her. The waltz continued, and they were close enough that he could hear her breathing, and the fiddle and guitar rose and fell around them with the particular bittersweet quality of music heard in a large, warm room on a cool spring night, and Edgar realized with the finality of something arriving after a very long journey that he was in serious difficulty. He was not, and had not been for a very long time, a man who allowed himself to want things that could be taken away. He was wanting something very badly right now, and it was looking up at him with dark-water eyes. The waltz ended. They stepped apart. Minnie looked at him for a moment with an expression that was quiet and luminous and extraordinarily careful. "Thank you for the dance," she said. "Thank you for making me ask," he said. She laughed that full, warm, unguarded laugh, and they went back to standing near the wall together, and this time they stood close enough that his shoulder was against hers, and neither of them moved away. In early June, Minnie's situation in the Hatch household shifted. Clara's husband Daniel announced that the mine was expanding eastward, and that he had been offered the position of head foreman, which would require them to move to the new camp 12 miles out. It was a good opportunity, and they would take it, but the house in Caldera Flats would be let rather than left empty, and Minnie would need to find her own arrangement. Mrs. Edna Park, who had developed a strong respect for Minnie's teaching work, came to Minnie with an offer from the settlement committee. If she would take on a formal role as schoolteacher, occupying the single classroom that was to be finished in the newly completed East Building by July, she would receive a monthly wage and the use of a small room above the land office where Parker had already vacated. Minnie accepted both without hesitation. Edgar heard about all of this in stages, partly from Daniel and partly from Minnie herself, and processed it with the quiet, watchful attentiveness of a man who is paying close attention to everything. The day after Clara and Daniel moved to the new camp, he went to the church in the morning and worked until noon and then put down his tools and walked to the land office. Minnie was upstairs in the small room, which was barely 8 feet by 10 and contained a rope bed, a single chair, a washstand, and a window overlooking the main street. She was unpacking her canvas traveling bag, the same bag Edgar had collected from the desert floor 2 months ago, with the orderly efficiency of someone who has been packing and unpacking for long enough to have a system. He stood in the doorway again. He seemed to spend a great deal of time in her doorways. "It's small," he said. "It's mine," she said, and the way she said it told him everything about what that meant to her. He nodded. He came in a step because the room was too small for any proper distance, and he stood near the window. "Minnie," he said. She turned around and looked at him, and she had clearly known this moment was approaching because she looked neither surprised nor alarmed, only steady and open and entirely herself. "I'm not a man who's easy to know," he said. "I don't have much to offer in the way of ease. I've been solitary a long time and I don't always know what to do with other people. I've spent the better part of 10 years not building anything and not putting down roots and not thinking about the future in any particular way." "I know all of that," she said. "I'm telling you because I want you to know it clearly, not because I'm making an excuse." "Edgar," she said gently, "say the thing." He looked at her. "I love you," he said, which was the most direct and frightening thing he had said to another person in a decade. "I don't know when it happened except that by the time I knew it, it had already been true for a while and I'd like—" He stopped. He tried again. "I'd like to court you properly if you'll let me. I'd like to stop being a man who's just passing through." Minnie was quiet for exactly the right amount of time, not hesitant, not theatrical, just present with the weight of what he'd said. "I have been," she said, carefully and honestly, "waiting for you to say that since approximately the second day on the trail." He let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. She took 2 steps toward him, which used up most of the distance in the small room, and looked up at him with an expression that was direct and warm and afraid in exactly the way that things that matter are always a little afraid. "I love you too," she said. "I don't know a great many things about my future here, but I know that." Edgar reached out and took her hand, which was the most natural thing he had ever done, and she held on with the same steadiness she brought to everything. He was not a man given to sudden movements, but he leaned forward and pressed a careful kiss to her forehead, right at the edge of the scar from the cut at her temple that had long since healed to a thin silver line, and she closed her eyes briefly, and then opened them, and they were still standing in the small room above the main street of Caldera Flats in the warm June afternoon. But everything was different in the way everything is different when you have found the thing you didn't know you were looking for. The courtship, as such, was conducted with the particular quality that both of them brought to most things: quiet, direct, and without pretense. They walked in the evenings after Edgar's work was done, and after Minnie's schoolroom was closed. They sat on the steps of the church, which was now substantially complete and smelled of new wood and linseed oil, and talked with the unhurried thoroughness of 2 people who have been careful with themselves for a long time, and find the release of not being careful a genuinely extraordinary thing. Minnie told him about Springfield and her father who had died at Gettysburg, and the years of her mother's difficult second marriage to a man named Hennessy who drank quietly and spent lavishly, and believed that women's opinions were most valuable when unspoken. She told it without bitterness and without self-pity, in the same clear tone she used for everything, but Edgar could hear in it the source of her independence, the careful self-sufficiency she had built in the years of being in a house where she was present but not considered. Edgar told her about the war, only partially. He was not yet ready to tell all of it, and she understood without being told that there were things he would say in time. He told her about the carpenter's trade he had learned from his father, who had been a skilled and exacting man with wood. He told her about the years after the war when he had drifted because he could not find a reason to stop drifting. He told her about the loneliness that he had refused to call loneliness for a very long time. She listened to all of it without flinching and without trying to fix what did not need fixing, which was one of the finest things she did. In mid-July, Edgar finished the church. He sat in the front pew on the last afternoon and looked at what he had built, the clean lines of the interior, the planed wood of the pews with their smooth surfaces, the window casings that fit square and tight, the pulpit that was solid and proportional and would serve whoever stood at it for decades, and felt, for the first time in many years, the particular satisfaction of work completed and left well. The first service was held the following Sunday, and the settlement turned out with the self-conscious pride of a community marking a threshold. Edgar sat in the third pew with Minnie beside him and their shoulders touching, and when the minister, a traveling preacher named Aldridge who came through the settlement monthly, delivered his sermon, Edgar found that he was paying attention to it in a way he had not paid attention to sermons in a long time. The church committee retained Edgar for a new project afterward, building a schoolhouse proper, which Minnie's successful work with the children had pushed to the top of the settlement committee's priorities. It would be a single-room building with real windows, proper ventilation, 2 doors, and a bell tower. It was 6 weeks of solid work. He accepted the contract. He had stopped planning to move on without entirely deciding to stop. It had happened the way drums slowed on the trail without being asked, in response to something that mattered. On an evening in August, they were sitting on the top step of the almost finished schoolhouse, the sun declining over the western desert in a long spread of copper and rose that was almost excessive in its beauty, and Edgar said, "Will you marry me?" He had been intending to make more of a speech. He had thought about it for 2 weeks and had prepared several things to say. What came out was just the 4 words, direct and plain and entirely earnest. Minnie turned to look at him. There were tears in her eyes, which was the first time he had seen tears in her eyes for any reason other than fever, and it startled him enough that he started to say something. "Yes," she said before he could. "Yes, obviously yes." He felt something happen in his chest that he did not have a word for. Something that was relief and joy and terror, all happening at once in the most extraordinary way. He put both arms around her and held her, and she held back with her face against his neck, and the desert turned all its colors in the late sun, and the settlement of Caldera Flats went about its evening business beyond them without ceremony. "I've been terrified," he admitted into her hair. "Of what?" she asked. "Of wanting something this much," he said. She pulled back enough to look at him. "Edgar," she said, "you cannot honestly have believed I would say no. I didn't know what you'd say. You're a very independent woman. I'm an independent woman who has been hopelessly in love with you since you told me you'd stayed at the relay station because your horse slowed down," she said. That is the most Edgar Shelby reason possible to do a kind and life-saving thing, and I knew then that I was entirely lost. He looked at her for a long moment, at the face that he had memorized without meaning to, the freckles across her nose, the wide mouth, the dark water eyes, and he thought about the morning in April when Drum had slowed, and he had seen the crumpled figure in the desert dust, and told himself he was only going to assess the situation. "I was lost before you were well," he said. She smiled, and it was the smile he'd been watching all summer and still wasn't accustomed to. "I know," she said. He kissed her then properly, the way he had wanted to for months, and she kissed him back without any hesitation at all. They were married in October, in the church that Edgar had built, by the same traveling minister Aldridge who had given the first sermon there, on a bright, cold morning with the sky, a hard, clean blue overhead, and the desert showing the sparse gold of autumn. Clara and Daniel Hatch came in from the mining camp for the occasion, Daniel having borrowed a wagon, and Clara having somehow transported a wedding cake wrapped in a cloth, which she unwrapped in the church hall after the ceremony, with the triumphant expression of someone who has achieved something against the odds. The settlement turned out with the enthusiasm communities bring to their own love stories, because there is always something affirming about watching two careful, private people give themselves to each other without reservation. Minnie wore a dress that Clara and Mrs. Park and two of the mining family's wives had collectively constructed over the previous month from materials ordered from Reno. A deep blue that was not the washed-out pale blue of the dress she'd been wearing in the desert, but a rich, certain blue that was the color of her own decision about this moment. She wore her dark hair pinned up with a comb that had been her mother's, and that she had carried in the canvas traveling bag all the way from Missouri. When she came through the church door on Daniel Hatch's arm, Daniel having been appointed this honor because he was the closest thing either of them had to a family present, and Edgar saw her from the front of the room, he felt the full force of everything that had brought them to this moment. The horse that slowed on the trail, the woman in the dust, the relay station and Bess Grover's competent hands, the long ride to Caldera Flats, the kitchen table and the evenings and the dance and the small room and all of it, every moment of the strange, unplanned journey from solitude to here. He had not been looking for this. It had found him in the desert and had been looking at him with steady dark-water eyes ever since, waiting for him to understand. He understood. She reached him, and Daniel gave her hand to him with a quiet sincerity, and Edgar held it with the care he had once given to something he did not yet fully understand, and now gave with the certainty of a man who understands completely and is not afraid. "You look extraordinary," he said softly, and she ducked her head briefly with the private smile she kept for moments that were just his. "Don't make me cry before we've even started," she whispered back. He squeezed her hand and they faced the minister together, and the ceremony began. The winter of 1878 settled over Caldera Flats with the particular severity of the high desert at altitude, cold nights that made the stars look sharp as glass. Days that were bright and brittle, occasional snow that came and went with insufficient drama to be romantic but sufficient persistence to be inconvenient. Edgar and Minnie established themselves in a rented house at the west edge of the settlement. 3 rooms with a proper stone fireplace, and a south-facing window that caught most of the day's sun, and made the main room warm and light in a way that felt almost extravagant. Edgar spent the winter working on the schoolhouse completion, and then taking on smaller commissions, furniture orders, 2 sets of doors for the new boarding house, a set of cabinets for the doctor's office. He had a reputation now in the settlement as someone whose work was precise and reliable and worth waiting for, which was a reputation he had not consciously built but found he was glad to have. Minnie ran her school with dedicated authority. By November she had 12 children enrolled, and by January there was talk of a second teacher being hired in the fall to handle the older students while Minnie focused on the younger ones. She had also, in the manner of someone who finds useful work wherever she looks, started an evening reading group for the adult women of the settlement mining wives, mostly, who had more education than the frontier had so far asked of them. They met on Thursday evenings in the schoolroom with a lamp and a shared book, and the particular pleasure of minds being used properly. Edgar went to sleep each night with the sound of Minnie reading in the next room while he lay in the dark, the low, warm current of her voice carrying through the wall without the words being fully clear. And it was, of all the extraordinary things that had happened to him in this year, perhaps the most ordinary and the most deeply good. They were happy in the way that is not performance, not the bright, anxious happiness of people trying to convince themselves, but the quieter, more durable kind that comes from 2 people in their right places. They argued sometimes. Minnie was no more inclined to suppress her opinions in marriage than she had been at any other point, and Edgar's habitual self-sufficiency sometimes made him close a door in himself that she had to patiently knock on until he opened it. But their arguments resolved in the direct, honest way of people who trust each other's intentions completely, even when they disagree about the particulars. In February, Minnie told Edgar she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen after supper, with the directness he had come to love about her, and she watched his face with that careful attention. What happened on Edgar's face was something he made no effort to contain. It was not a simple thing. It was large and complicated and moved through him like weather. But at the center of it was a joy so immediate and so physical that it surprised even him. He stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen to where she was standing and held her face in both his hands and looked at her and could not immediately speak. "Edgar," she said, reading him with the ease of someone who has made a thorough study of a subject, "are you all right?" "I am," he managed. "I am more than all right." "I am—" He stopped and shook his head, and the truth of it was too large for words, so he simply held her close and put his lips to her hair, and she put her arms around him and held on. "I was hoping you'd be glad," she said, with her face against his chest. "I'm not glad," he said. "I'm overwhelmed. Those are different things, and the second is larger." She laughed, muffled by his shirt. They stayed that way in the kitchen for a long time, the fire burning down in the grate, the night pressing quietly at the windows, the whole future rearranging itself around them with the gentle inevitability of something meant. Spring came and summer, and Minnie continued teaching until July, which was further into the pregnancy than Mrs. Park thought entirely proper and further than Dr. Kellner thought entirely prudent. But Minnie had thoughts of her own on the subject, and the new teacher, a young man fresh from the East named Whitmore, was not ready to manage all the students alone, and she was not willing to let the children down for propriety's sake. Edgar watched all of this with the combination of admiration and well-concealed anxiety that was his characteristic response to his wife's determination. He said nothing much about it because he had learned that saying things about Minnie's determination was approximately as effective as reasoning with the desert wind, and considerably less dignified. He had finished the schoolhouse and started work on a new project he had taken on independently. A house. Not a rented three-room house at the edge of the settlement, but a proper house on a piece of land at the north end of town that the committee had granted for purchase at a fair price, considering his contribution to the settlement's buildings. It was going to have 4 rooms and a covered porch and a garden space on the south side where Minnie had already decided she intended to grow things. He built it in the evenings and on Sundays. And sometimes on Saturday mornings, Daniel Hatch came in from the mining camp and worked alongside him with the quiet companionship of a man who knows how to be useful without making a production of it. Clara came with Daniel on those days and sat with Minnie on the unfinished porch, watching the frames go up with the proprietary satisfaction of women who understand that a house being built is a life being built. The baby was born in September of 1879, in the house that was almost but not quite finished. They had moved in August, with 2 rooms complete and the other 2 framed and the porch not yet roofed, because the baby was not going to wait on carpentry schedules. He was a boy, born just before dawn on a cool September morning with a thin slice of new moon over the desert, with Dr. Kellner and a midwife named Mrs. Bright in attendance and Edgar in the next room unable to sit down and moving around the kitchen with the focused aimlessness of a man in the grip of something larger than he can manage. When Mrs. Bright called him in, he went. Minnie was tired in a way that went all the way through her, but her eyes were clear and present, and she was holding the baby with the particular expression of someone comprehending something they cannot yet fully articulate. She looked up at Edgar when he came in, and the expression changed to the one she kept for him. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son. The baby was very new and very real, red-faced and dark-haired, and making small, insistent sounds that seemed to be communicating something of great urgency to a world that was not yet certain what to make of him. "He looks like he has opinions," Edgar said. "He absolutely does," Minnie said, and her voice was exhausted and laughing and full of a love so immediate it practically had weight and temperature. "He gets that from somewhere." "He does," Edgar agreed and looked up from the baby to Minnie and felt the word lost arrive in him fully, without any shadow of the meaning it used to carry. He had been lost before her and had not known it. He was lost in her and had never been more found. "What shall we call him?" Minnie asked. Edgar looked at the boy, who had settled slightly, small fists uncurling with the gradual trust of someone adjusting to a new country. "James," he said, which had been his father's name, the careful and exacting man who had given him the craft that had built this house. Minnie considered it. "James Shelby," she said, trying it out. "Yes, that's right." Edgar put one careful finger into the baby's small fist and James Shelby gripped it with the absolute conviction of someone who intends to hold on to things. The autumn of 1879 and the winter that followed was a season of particular richness, the kind that comes when you are in the right place with the right people and the work of your life has meaning and direction. Edgar finished the house, the last 2 rooms, the porch roof, the south-facing garden space that Minnie had been describing to him since February with increasing specificity. He built James a cradle from a piece of ash wood that Rhodes at the hardware store had ordered for him especially, carved with a simple border pattern that took 2 weeks of evening work. Minnie returned to teaching in November, leaving James in the capable care of Mrs. Bright, who had developed a strong affection for the baby, and who occupied the schoolroom's adjoining house and could hear if anything required attention. This arrangement was managed with Minnie's characteristic practicality and the settled assurance of someone who has thought through all the angles. The settlement grew around them through that winter and into the next spring. The silver mine expanded eastward with the steady momentum of a productive operation, bringing new families, new businesses, a proper hotel that opened in the spring of 1880, and eventually the kind of infrastructure that turns a settlement into a town. A telegraph line reached Caldera Flats in April of 1880, which was greeted with the collective excitement of a community that has been doing without news for long enough to appreciate the arrival of it. Edgar took on more work, a general contracting operation essentially, with 2 men he hired through the summer of 1880, a carpenter named Gideon Wash and a younger man named Peto Reyes, who was Gordo the fiddler's nephew, and who worked with the focused energy of someone with much to prove. They were good men, and Edgar managed them with the same direct, unhurried competence he brought to his own work. He found himself, to his occasional surprise, building things not just in wood but in the settlement itself, the kind of presence that a man acquires when he has put down roots deep enough that people stop thinking of him as someone who might leave. Minnie's school continued to grow. By the end of 1880, there were 22 children enrolled, and young Whitmore was handling the older students while Minnie focused on the primary grades and the special cases, the children who were slow with letters, the ones who were gifted enough to need more than the standard curriculum, and always, particularly, the girls who showed the quick, hungry intelligence that Minnie recognized from the inside and had decided she would not allow the frontier to waste. Rose Patterly, who was now 15 and had been Minnie's student for 2 years, was reading philosophy texts that Minnie ordered from a bookshop in San Francisco and borrowing Edgar's volumes of history, with the systematic appetite of someone building a library inside her own mind. Minnie had written 2 letters on Rose's behalf to a teachers' college in Sacramento, and Rose's father, a Scottish miner named Hamish Patterly, who had the traditional respect for education that Minnie had correctly identified and appealed to, had agreed that if Rose was accepted, he would find the means to send her. Edgar heard about all of this in the evenings, Minnie talking while he fed James, or while they sat at the table after dinner, with the comfortable latitude of a couple who have moved past performance and into the real life of each other. And he listened with the attentive pleasure of a man who has discovered, later than some, but no less fully, that the world is considerably more interesting when there is someone to discuss it with. In December of 1880, on an evening of absolute clear cold with the stars doing their best work above the desert, Edgar and Minnie sat on the completed porch of their house after James was asleep, wrapped in heavy blankets and sharing the last of a bottle of wine that Daniel Hatch had brought from Reno as a gift. "Do you remember," Minnie said, "what you told me on the trail about the loneliness? About wanting to turn and tell someone, did you see that?" "Yes," he said. "Does it still happen?" That feeling, he thought about it honestly. "Yes, sometimes. But now when it happens, I know I can turn and tell you, so it's different, it doesn't carry the same weight." She was quiet for a moment, her shoulder against his under the blanket. "I think about that trail sometimes," she said. "About what I thought in those confused hours when I was feverish and walking and I didn't know where I was or what was happening. I think I was walking toward you." She paused. "I know that's not rational." "I think you were walking away from the stage," he said, because he was a practical man. She laughed. "Yes, that too, but perhaps both things can be true." He thought about Drum slowing on the trail. He thought about the moment he had looked down from the saddle and seen her in the desert dust, and told himself firmly that he was only going to assess the situation. "Both things can be true," he agreed. She leaned her head against his shoulder and they sat in the cold, clear, enormous dark, and the settlement of Caldera Flats breathed and settled around them, and far to the east the mountains held the sky with their permanent certainty. It was a good life. Edgar thought this with the full force of a man who had lived the alternative long enough to know the difference. It was a good life, and he had not built it by planning. He had built it the way he had always built his best work, by showing up, paying attention, and not walking away from what mattered. Spring of 1881 arrived with the desert's characteristic lack of transition. 1 week cold and the next brilliantly, aggressively alive, the sage blooming and the cottonwoods throwing out their new leaves with reckless enthusiasm. Minnie's garden on the south side of the house, which she had been planning through the winter in a notebook with sketch diagrams, was planted in March with a determination that had Edgar constructing a proper fence around it to protect against rabbits and the wandering interests of Mrs. Bright's chickens from next door. James, now 18 months old and in the fully mobile, fully opinionated phase of his development, took a passionate interest in the garden and in the general project of disturbing everything that had been carefully arranged. He was an easy child in the ways that mattered, sleeping reliably, eating without theater, possessing a good-natured resilience to small setbacks, and demanding in the ways that were simply the honest demands of a growing intelligence needing constant occupation. He had Minnie's directness and Edgar's precision, and an independently arrived at passion for dogs that neither parent fully understood but both accommodated. Edgar found him a dog in May, a large, amiable cattle dog with one blue eye, and one brown from a rancher outside town named Calloway who had too many dogs and needed to reduce his population. James named the dog Coin on the grounds that the dog had 2 different colored eyes, and James had recently discovered coins and found them extraordinary, and the logical connection between these 2 facts was apparently clear to James, if not entirely to anyone else. Coin was devoted and reliable and prone to sleeping in inconvenient places, and Edgar regarded the animal with the warm tolerance of a man who recognizes that some negotiations are not worth entering. Bess Grover wrote a letter that summer addressed to Edgar Shelby, care of the Caldera Flats Post, which arrived in July. It was 4 lines in a large, clear hand. The relay station was doing well. Walt had broken his left arm in March and it was now fully healed. She was glad to hear they had done well, and she had known they would. Edgar read it twice and then handed it to Minnie and watched her read it. "We should visit," Minnie said. "It's a long ride with a child and a dog," Edgar said. "Bess would want to see him," Minnie said, meaning James. "She told me, the morning we left, that she expected to hear good things of us. I think we should report in person." They went in August, the 4 of them, Edgar and Minnie and James and Coin, in a wagon rather than on Drum, though Drum was tied to the back and maintained his dignified disapproval of the cattle dog for the entire journey. It was 2 days' travel and one night camping near the same seasonal creek where they had stopped on their first journey together, the one with the cottonwoods. Edgar watered Drum at the creek, while Minnie sat on the flat rock at the water's edge with James in her lap, pointing out the fish in the shallows to the boys' complete and reverent amazement. Coin lay nearby with his chin on his paws, watching the fish with a professional interest. Edgar watched them, this woman, this boy, this dog, this creek, this light, and felt the presence of the April morning 3 years ago when he had ridden along the northern trail on his way to collect $43 from Horace Tuttle, with no particular intention beyond the next destination and no understanding of how entirely everything was about to change. He was the luckiest man in the territory. He was reasonably certain of this. Bess Grover met them at Harker's Rest with the same sharp, observant expression and the same severe pinned gray hair, but there was something in her face when she saw Minnie healthy and upright and sun-browned, holding a vigorous child that was unmistakably gratification. She examined James with the practical efficiency of someone who has formed an immediate opinion and found it confirmed. "He's healthy," she said. "Very," Minnie said. "Good bones," Bess said approvingly, which apparently settled the matter. Walt Grover emerged from the back, arm fully healed and functioning, and the two men shook hands with the warm ease of people who have always gotten along and don't need to make a fuss about it. Walt had found a new relay driver, which had solved a staffing problem that had been chronic since the previous autumn, and the station was well. They stayed 2 days, sleeping in the relay station's back room on a rope bed that creaked when James rolled over, which he did frequently, and eating Bess's cooking, which was the best in the desert and probably the best in several other landscapes as well. Minnie and Bess sat together in the evenings with a kind of ease that was not surprising. Both women had the same fundamental quality, the no-nonsense intelligence and genuine warmth that knew how to recognize itself in others. On the last evening, Bess and Edgar sat on the bench outside while the desert turned its late colors. "I knew," Bess said without preamble. "Knew what?" "That first day, when you kept fixing things without being asked." She looked at the sky with the equanimity of someone for whom the desert's beauty has become so habitual that she can appreciate it without drama. A man doesn't fix fences and shoe horses for a woman he's just going to ride away from. "I didn't know that at the time," Edgar said. "I know," she said, and smiled in the manner of someone who has watched the world long enough to find its small self-deceptions entirely endearing. "That's the best part." The ride back to Caldera Flats was 2 days of easy travel, James sleeping in the wagon bed with Coin, while the desert moved past them in the long, amber light of late August. Minnie sat beside Edgar on the wagon seat, and they talked in the unhurried, far-ranging way of people who have read the same books and shared the same years, whose conversations start in one place and end up in another entirely, following the logic of shared curiosity and mutual interest. She told him she was expecting again. She said it matter-of-factly, watching the horizon, and then looked sideways at him to see what would happen on his face. What happened was the same as last time, except more so, because he had a template now. He knew what it meant. He knew what the new small life would become, this particular life made from the two of them, arriving into this house in this settlement in this desert that had been so brutal and was now so fully home. "When?" he asked. "March, I expect." He reached over and took her hand from her lap, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they rode in silence for a mile or so with the horses finding their own pace and the August desert going gold around them. "I thought about names last time before we knew," she said. "And, if it's a boy, I'd like Thomas," she said. "For my father." "Thomas," Edgar said, and thought of a man who had gone to Gettysburg and not come back, and left behind a daughter who had traveled the whole length of the country and nearly died in the desert, and arrived at this particular life with her mother's comb in her traveling bag, and a directness in her eyes that the country had not been able to touch. "Thomas Shelby, yes. And if it's a girl, He thought about it for a moment. Me, he said. After my mother, he paused. Me Shelby, what do you think? Minnie tried it. Me Shelby, she said. That's a good name. Just a thought, he said. It's not just a thought, she said, and you know it. He squeezed her hand and she squeezed back, and they drove on through the afternoon. The baby arrived in March of 1882, on schedule as Minnie had predicted, because Minnie had a particular talent for accurate forecasting. It was a girl, born in the early evening with a quality of absolute determined arrival about her, as if she had places to go and was already behind schedule, and she was placed in Edgar's arms while Dr. Kellner attended to Minnie, and Edgar stood holding this daughter in the lamplight of the room he had built with the same hands, and felt the world reconfigure itself once more around a new center of gravity. Me? Minnie asked from the bed, reading his face. Me, he confirmed. Me Shelby announced herself to the world with a full-throated declaration of her presence that woke James in the next room, and set Coin shifting uneasily at the foot of the bed, and was thoroughly herself from approximately the first minute. James, having been prepared for this development over several months by both parents, approached his new sister with the solemn gravity of a 2-year-old undertaking a significant responsibility, stood at the edge of the bed, looked at her for a long moment, and then said, with the comprehensive judgment of someone who has considered the question from all angles, that she was very small. This was accurate. Minnie confirmed it. James appeared satisfied. Life in Caldera Flats continued to grow and shift through the years that followed. The silver mine produced reliably through the early 1880s, and the town became what it had intended to be: permanent, productive, community-minded. The church Edgar had built became a cornerstone of the settlement's life, as did the schoolhouse. Minnie's school grew to 30 students by 1883, and she had the pleasure of seeing Rose Patterly accepted to the Teachers' College in Sacramento, going off east on the stage with her father's blessing and her mother's tears and Minnie's long, carefully assembled letter of recommendation in her bag. Edgar's contracting work expanded steadily. He built houses, barns, a new stable at the edge of town, and an extension to the hotel that included a proper reading room at the hotel owner's wife's insistence. Gideon Wash stayed on as his primary assistant, and Pedo Reyes, who had learned carpentry properly under Edgar's instruction, was now capable of managing full projects independently and had an excellent reputation of his own. The territory was changing around them. Nevada had been a state since 1864, and the pace of settlement in the region was increasing through the late 1870s and early 1880s, bringing new people and new pressures. Edgar watched the changes with the attentive care of someone who has put down roots and therefore has a direct interest in the quality of the soil. He attended the town meetings where decisions were made about water rights, road management, and the growing question of how the settlement would manage its relationship with the Paiute communities, whose territory the settlement occupied, by the complex and unjust mechanics of federal policy. He was not the loudest voice in these meetings, but he was consistent, and he spoke when he had something to say that mattered. Minnie was characteristically more direct about it. She taught her students, including the 2 Paiute children whose families had chosen to engage with the settlement school, with the same complete investment she gave to all of them. She said publicly, in the plain, unembellished way she said things that needed saying, that the dispossession of the Paiute people from their land was an injustice that would follow the territory for generations regardless of whether people preferred to look away from it. This was not a universally popular position in a settlement built on that land. It was, nonetheless, a consistent one, and over time the consistency of it earned a respect that the popularity might not have. Edgar backed her in this, as he backed her in everything, not always with words, but with the quiet, steady alignment of a man whose values are not separate from his actions. James grew from the solemn toddler into a bright, somewhat serious boy with his father's precision and his mother's directness, and an abiding passion for natural science that Minnie fed with books and Edgar fed, by taking him on long rides through the desert where Edgar would name what he knew and James would ask questions about what Edgar didn't know, and then they would come home and look it up together. Me grew from the determined, full-throated arrival into a determined, full-throated 4-year-old, and then 5-year-old with her mother's dark hair and her father's measuring eyes, and an independent spirit that manifested in the conviction that she was fully competent to do any task currently being performed by anyone older than herself, and that the appropriate response to evidence to the contrary was a more detailed plan. Edgar loved them both with the straightforward, uncomplicated certainty of a man who had once been afraid to want things. He had stopped being afraid, sometime in the years since the trail and the relay station, and the walk across the settlement in the June afternoon light. He did not know exactly when. He knew it had happened, and he was grateful for it every morning when he woke in the house he had built with the woman he had not been looking for sleeping beside him, and the sound of his children beginning to stir in the rooms down the hall. In 1884, they celebrated James's 5th birthday in the garden that Minnie had planted and expanded and replanted over 4 years, which had become a genuine and productive thing. Tomatoes and beans and kitchen herbs, and one ambitious rosebush that Edgar had built a frame for, and which had repaid the investment with spectacular indifference for 2 years, and then suddenly bloomed in the spring of 1883 as if it had been planning the move all along. There were 12 children in the garden for James's birthday, running in the chaotic, joyful patterns of children with room to run, and all 4 of the hatched children, Daniel and Clara, had 3 more since moving to the mining camp, among them, and Coin moving through the chaos with the slightly overwhelmed patience of a dog who has made a commitment to social tolerance. Daniel Hatch sat on the porch steps with Edgar and watched the garden with the comfortable satisfaction of a man who has watched his friend become himself. He had a bottle of decent beer from the new brewery that had opened in Caldera Flats that winter, and the afternoon was warm and the sound of the children in the garden was the specific music of a good day. "I remember," Daniel said, "when Clara told me about you, about the man who'd found Minnie in the desert and brought her to the relay station. I remember meeting you," Edgar said. "I thought," Daniel said, "you seemed like a man who had been alone so long that civilization was slightly surprising to him, like someone coming in from a very long winter." "That's fair," Edgar said. Daniel took a long drink of his beer. "Well," he said simply, with the economy of a man who does not need many words to say a complete thing, "it's a good spring you've landed in." Edgar looked at the garden, the running children, the brilliant rosebush, the garden Minnie had designed in her winter notebook with her careful diagrams, the house at its back that he had built plank by plank with his own hands. He looked at the porch where Minnie was standing with Clara and Mrs. Park, the 3 of them deep in a conversation that involved considerable laughter, Minnie with me on her hip, his daughter gesturing with one hand at something that was clearly of great importance. He thought of the April morning in 1878 when Drum had slowed on the trail north of the Juniper Fork, and the crumpled figure in the desert dust, and the 4 words he had said to his horse and himself, and no one in particular. He thought of all the days since, the relay station, the long ride, the kitchen table, the evenings on the porch, the church he'd built and the school and the house, the dance and the question asked too directly and the answer given immediately, the son and the daughter and the garden and the years laid down like good timber in a solid structure. He had not been looking for love when he found her unconscious on the trail. He had been looking for $43 and he had expected nothing further. What had found him instead was everything. "It is," Edgar said. "It is a very good spring." Minnie looked over from the porch as if she'd heard him, which she couldn't have, but she sometimes did this, looked over at precisely the right moment with precisely the right expression, as if she had been tracking him even when she wasn't watching. She smiled, that smile that was just his, and turned back to her conversation. James ran past the porch steps with 3 other children in pursuit, shouting something about a frog he had found at the base of the garden wall, and me lunged from Minnie's hip with complete conviction in the direction of the frog commotion, and Minnie caught her and said something that made Clara laugh, and the afternoon held all of it. The children and the laughter and the frog and the beer and the desert going gold beyond the garden fence in the long late sun. And Edgar sat on the step of the house he had built and held all of it and was not lost at all. He was, at last, precisely found. The years settled gently after that, not without difficulty, because nothing worth having is without difficulty, but with the steady, reliable quality of a life that has found its proper form. James started at Minnie's school in the fall of 1884 and was by his mother's honest assessment a strong student, and by his father's quiet observation a genuinely kind one, which mattered more. Me, impatient with the timeline, spent the following 2 years conducting her own educational program by standing at the back of her mother's classroom whenever possible and acquiring reading significantly ahead of schedule, to the resigned admiration of both parents. The Caldera Flats silver mine produced through the mid-1880s with steady confidence, and the town that had grown around it became the kind of place that has libraries and debates and ambitions beyond the next silver vein. Edgar built a reading room addition to the school in 1885, a long, well-lit space with proper shelving and windows on 2 sides, at the town committee's request. He did it at a reduced rate, and added a dedicated section of low shelving that a small person could reach without assistance, because he had a specific small person in mind. Me found the shelving immediately and with complete satisfaction. In the winter of 1886, Minnie and Edgar sat at the kitchen table long after supper was cleared, the children asleep, the fire burning low, and Minnie said she had been thinking. "About what?" Edgar asked. "About the fact that we have been here 8 years, she said, "and that I came here with nothing except a canvas bag and my cousin's address and a great deal of stubbornness, and that I am sitting in a house I love in a town I have helped to build, teaching children who will build something further with what they learn, and that the man across this table from me is the reason I am alive to do any of it." Edgar looked at her steadily. In 8 years the freckles had multiplied slightly, which the summer sun was responsible for, and there was a fine line at the corner of each eye that had not been there in the desert, and her dark hair had a few silver threads at the temple near the scar. She was more beautiful to him than she had been on any previous day, which was a thing he had noticed gradually. That love did not diminish the perception of beauty but deepened it, added layer and dimension and history to it, so that what he saw was not just her face but everything they had done together. "You'd have survived without me," he said. "I might have," she allowed. "But you didn't ride on." She held his gaze. "You didn't ride on." Drum slowed down. "Edgar," she said, with the particular tone she used when she was not going to let him understate the thing, "you didn't ride on. Whatever the reason for stopping, you stayed. Every day since you've stayed. You built me a house. You built my school a library. You sat with my children and read them books and taught James the names of every bird in the territory, and stood next to me at every town meeting where I said uncomfortable things. And you never once—" She stopped and pressed her fingers briefly against her eyes. When she looked up again, they were bright. "You never once made me feel like my opinions were an inconvenience." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "You are," he said carefully, with the deliberate honesty of a man who chooses words for their accuracy, "the most important thing that has ever happened to me. You and our children, that's not just a statement. It is the complete account of my life since 1878. She turned her hand over under his and held on. "I was dying in that desert," she said quietly. "I think when I was walking in the fever, I knew I was dying and some part of me decided not to, and I don't entirely know why. And then there you were." She looked at him across the table in the firelight, in the house he had built, in the town they had grown in together. "I am so grateful," she said, Every single day I am so grateful." "So am I," he said, and the two of them were enough, the simple, equal weight of two people who found each other and chose each other, and built something from it that had outlasted every reason to doubt it could be done. The last thing worth telling about that winter in Caldera Flats is this. On a clear, cold morning in February of 1887, the kind of morning where the desert air has a crystalline quality that makes the mountains visible at distances you wouldn't have believed in summer, Edgar and Minnie walked James and me to the school as they did every morning. Edgar and James slightly ahead, talking about the particular properties of frost on different surfaces, a topic James had brought up at breakfast, and Minnie and me slightly behind. Me conducting an analysis of the cloud formations that she had decided required documentation, and was therefore making Minnie hold her notebook while she pointed. At the school gate they stopped, and Edgar crouched to his daughter's height and adjusted her scarf, which had come unwound in the way Me's things had a tendency to do, having been put on in some haste and with considerable independent judgment. "Today," Me told him, with great seriousness. "What about today?" he asked. "Today is a good day," she said, with the settled conviction of someone who has reviewed the available evidence and arrived at a conclusion. He looked up at Minnie over Me's head, and Minnie was looking back at him with that expression, the clear, warm, certain expression of a woman who has found her right place and her right person and knows it fully and does not take it for granted. "Yes," Edgar said, to his daughter and to the morning and to everything. "It is." He stood up and took Minnie's hand, and they walked their children through the school gate into the ordinary, extraordinary morning. And behind them the desert spread wide and permanent in the early light, holding the silence and the distance and the long memory of an April trail where a horse had slowed for a reason, and a man had climbed down from the saddle, and everything that mattered had begun.